All right. Good evening, and welcome to our program tonight, presenting Professor Gordon Chang's latest book, War, Race, and Culture: Journeys in Trans-Pacific and Asian American Histories, moderated by Professor Judy Tzu-Chun Wu. I'm Katie G. Salisbury, board president of the Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club, otherwise known as SAPAAC. And first, I'm going to give a few words about our organization. Established in 1989, SAPAC has historically been one of Stanford University's largest ethnic affinity groups and one of the largest alumni organizations with nearly 3,000 members. We are dedicated to connecting Asian American and Pacific Islander alumni to the university and to each other. Membership empowers you to attend numerous events in your region, engage with a thriving alumni community, and receive the latest communications about our alma mater from an AAPI perspective. If you are a Stanford alumni who is tuning in and are not already a SAPAC member, we encourage you to join the club and sign up for our monthly newsletter. Membership is free, and you're also free to, encourage some of your friends and classmates to join as well. We do have a robust slate of events scheduled for this fall and into next year. So to learn more about SAPAC, you can visit us on our website, sapac.org, and I will drop the link into the chat later on. Now to introduce tonight's speakers, who almost needs no introduction. Gordon H. Chang, Stanford PhD, 87, is Professor of History and Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities at Stanford University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, and co-editor of The Chinese and the Iron Road, Building the Transcontinental Railroad, among many other books. Judy Tzu-Chun Wu, Stanford BA 92, MA 93, and PhD 98, who actually studied under Gordon and was his first graduate student, is Chancellor's Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She also serves as faculty director of the Humanities Center and associate dean in the School of Humanities of Research, Faculty Development, and Public Engagement. She received her PhD in US history from Stanford University and has a forthcoming book, Moving Mountains: Asian American and Pacific Islander Feminisms and the 1977 National Women's Conference, forthcoming from the University of Washington Press. She is also the co-author with Gwendolyn Mink of Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takamoto Mink, First Woman of Color in Congress. And you can also check out her comic biography, which is free for digital download, called Civics for All Comics Group. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Gordon, who will start with a short presentation.
All right. Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Judy, for serving today as a moderator. We'll get to our conversation in a bit. Um, I know Judy has some questions for me, but I thought I would do something a little bit different instead of the usual book talk, where I would start off talking about the book and maybe even reading a passage or something from it. Um, I'll just start off with a brief description of it, and then what I like to do is to go into a bit of a autobiography. I was looking at the participants here, and I see they're ticking up here, and then I already see a number of names that I know, good friends, some I've known for many, many years. But the idea of this book, which is a collection of 15 essays that I've written over my career, more than 30 years. Um, I came up with that idea when I was down in the Huntington Library a couple of years ago on a fellowship. And I was working on a project then, but then I also had the idea, well, I know a lot of people know some of my books or some of my articles. Some different people know different things, but no, many former students or graduates or others in the reading public really are not aware of the range of work that I've completed over the years. And that's because I've had an unusual academic or scholarly career where I've written in different subject areas, all related in some way by race, particularly with Asian Americans, but spanning very different time periods and also approaches and topics. I collected these essays and selected 15 out of a good other number of them, and grouped them together into what becomes what's now the title, War, Race, and Culture. War it contains the essays, 5 essays I've completed uh, that explore dimensions of diplomatic history, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-East Asia relations over the years. That was things I did largely earlier in my career. The second is race, where I collected different essays that I've written about Asian American history, including on Japanese American incarceration, on Chinese American exclusion laws, and also on the railroad workers, and also more on contemporary U.S.-China relations and Chinese Americans. And then the third area is culture, is where I present essays I've published before. Almost all the essays have been published before, but a few have not been. And this section holds essays I've completed on Asian American art history, painting, which is a very big interest of mine, and also a couple of articles on Asian American writers. So this, as you might see, that this is there's quite a span of topics and time periods from the 19th or mid 19th century all the way up to the current time. So we'll probably talk more about these in a moment with Judy, but I'd like to start off and share with you some slides from my own family and they, in a sense, give you a background of who I am. Many of you I've known for years. You may not know very much about my background. So I thought it'd be fun to do so, and also might give you a little insight into how and why I've written the way I've done. So I have too many slides to share tonight. I got kind of carried away, but here are some things which I would like to share with you today. Let's see if I can do this. All right, here we go. So I'm not going to go through this whole autobiography of mine, but some of the earlier periods I would like to do. Uh, oh, here we go. So this is the title of the book, and the cover. Actually, I'm making a comment on the cover. I love the cover. It's actually of a painting called Homage to the Railroad Workers, which was completed by Chinese American painter Alan Lau, who grew up in Sacramento, now lives up in Seattle, and he did this beautiful piece that is abstract, but also sort of inspired. It's definitely inspired by the history of Chinese railroad workers, and he did this in the 1970s. But it's a beautiful piece and kind of captures a lot of the energy and vibrancy and some of the topics that you find inside the book. Well, I want to start, with some story about my background, in particular on my mother's side. On my mother's side, I'm a Fong, and that's my grandfather on the left, and my grandmother, Lonnie Tom. I'm also sort of a Tom, so I might have more connections with more of you than you knew. As a Fong and as a Tom, and they were married. Now, this was their marriage photos up in Grass Valley in 1901. And they were not married in China. Lonnie was actually born in Marysville, and Fong Chow came to the United States in 1882. I don't think he came in with any papers. And after he came to the United States in 1882, he never left, which suggests to me that he didn't have papers and he was afraid of leaving and never being able to come back in. But I'm very proud of my ancestry. These are I have go back even further on Lonnie's side to her family in Marysville and in Sacramento. So I consider myself a longtime Californian, a fourth generation, and someone who has always been very interested in Chinese American history. Now, this is a great picture that shows where they lived after they got married. Where they lived. Fong Chow was the manager of one of the largest or most productive gold mines at that time at the turn of the century, still in operation in California. So he had quite a distinctive position and was a quite an accomplished manager and successful manager. But he lived up here in the small town in Washington, California, along the cold Yuba River that's flowing down from left to right. And the Chinatown is down on those wood shacks, as you can see, right along the river. And the main part of town was to the left. I've visited this town a number of times, but I kind of consider this my home village, if you will, in California. And that's a picture of Lonnie with their firstborn. I love this photo, which I found in a library up near Washington with her firstborn, Theodore. I call it a Chinese Mona Lisa photo, but it's a beautiful picture, I think. The tragedy, there's lots of tragedies in everyone's family. Theodore, who would be my Aldo's uncle, after he became a teenager, when he was a teenager, he was sent to China by his parents to for some education back in the village, but he got kidnapped by bandits and died in captivity. Well, these were some of the rest, these were the surviving members of the family. After they had moved from the gold country down to Vallejo, where they were born or went to high school. And among them is my auntie on the third from the left, Alice Fong Yu, was her name, very well known now because of the school named after her in San Francisco. She was a pioneer, as all of them were pioneers. They all went to college and they all had successful careers in small business and in professions. Nothing prestigious at the time because of the limitations that Chinese faced, but they were all did very well by themselves. Alice Fong Yu was the first Chinese American school teacher in San Francisco in 1924. Well, here you can see Grandpa. I'm always taken by this cover of the Chinese American press here, Chinese press. You can see the San Francisco votes repeal of the Exclusion Act. This was 1943. And Grandpa is taking the flag symbolizing his son who had died in Alaska in action during World War II. This was the son, the second son, as you can see in the back there, Uncle Albert, who went into the army and was killed in action. But there's a juxtaposition here of grief-stricken grandpa receiving the honor of his son, who was American-born, who fought in the war, and also juxtaposed to the Exclusion Act. Well, I grew up in the Oakland Hills. I didn't grow up in Chinatown, and I grew up largely in a community in the Oakland Hills, in the area of largely of white residents, and grew up in a what one might call typical Chinese or American family. I'm joining the Cub Scouts, and here I am with the American flag with my brother, and we're very proud Americans of that. But even though the community I lived in was mainly white, in our social life was really focused around the extended family, and these were all my aunts and uncles and cousins galore at one of our Christmas parties, as you can see here. There's so much I could talk about some of the different persons here. One I won't call her, I won't point out to her. She was now a retired prostitute. She had been brought into the country as a paper daughter and had served as a prostitute for some years. Another it was a couple of was a nightclub performer. Some of you know the story of the Forbidden City nightclub in San Francisco, and one of my aunties was one of the headliners there. Uh, so there was a family of quite diverse backgrounds. The uncles were all hardworking. They had stores, restaurants, or were worked as a bank clerk, and that was the kind of work that was available to them at the time. And you see all many of my cousins here. I'm sort of right in the middle with that striped shirt. My father isn't right in the middle of the back. He doesn't look well because he wasn't well, and he would pass because of cancer not long after this photo. So I grew up in a single family home. It was my mother and my brother and my father, who was an artist of international success and provided a good home for us. But unfortunately, he developed cancer when he was just in his mid 50s. Well, this was a picture I also like to show of my classmates at my elementary school. I'm in here as an officer of the traffic club, as you can see here in the front. But that's all the other people who are in my school. As you can see, not a very diverse group. Well, I did. It's unusual because I did well, and I got voted class president and valedictorian, as you can see here on the left, and had a pretty good academic career. And I got accepted to go to Stanford and also to Princeton, where I went this after graduation. And you can see me here as a fresh young frosh over here on the left. And then within a couple of years, I get radicalized. And this is what I say. And I've shown this photo, I think this picture to some of my classes. This is what happens to you after a couple of years of college. So I became radicalized because of the war in Vietnam and because of the Black Rebellion in the mid 1960s. And that forever changed my life. And that also is important to understand of why I write the way I do, and why I have always been very motivated by aspirations to seek a better life and progress and justice and peace in the world. ABC was Association of Black Collegians, which took over an administration building that's Princeton, and I've spoke outside, as you can see there. Now, Princeton alumni said the barbarians are at the gate here with this guy on the left and my friend here with the patch on. He looked like some pirate, but in fact, he just had pink eye, which was the reason he looks the way he does. Well, I graduated from Princeton, as you can see here. Here are my mother, a very proud time on the right here. And oh, Judy, you knew Terry Ho, who's to the left of me. That was my girlfriend at the time, my mother, and Princeton, one of the first class women who graduated from Princeton. One of them was Sue Jean Lee over there on the right. Well, I think I'll stop here before I go too much further, other than to say that after I went to attended Princeton, I came out to Stanford, but I didn't last very long because I was too radicalized. And I didn't care for the sedate and removed life of graduate school. So I left graduate school for 10 years. And unlike others who usually go to graduate school right after undergraduate, I didn't return to graduate school until 1982. I got my PhD in 1987. I was 40 years old, and so I entered academic life at a later time. So I have a number of books that I've published over the years, as you can see here, in diplomatic history, books on Asian American studies, uh, and also on railroads and on Asian American art history. And I'll end with this. These photos at the bottom, which I like, which shows me meeting Yoko Ono, who we talk about in our art history books and who came to Stanford at Dinkelspiel Auditorium to give an incredible talk and performance some years ago, and perhaps some of you were there. But that's my presentation of who I am and give you a little background. Now I'll end it here.
Thank you so much, Gordon. That is such a wonderful picture with you and Yoko Ono.
Yeah,
Pictures.
yeah, I love it.
I really appreciate those beautiful family portraits and also your story about yourself because that's how you begin the book is to think about how you developed as an intellectual, as a scholar in the context of your life. Um, Early on, you were more focused on diplomatic history, U.S. international relations with China and the Soviet Union. That was your first book. That was your dissertation and also your first book. And you mentioned that you were a little bit hesitant to go into the field of Asian American history because it was not yet fully developed at the time. Why is international relations so important for understanding Asian Americans or the experiences that Asian Americans have had in this country?
Good question. I've long been interested in international relations, perhaps because for two reasons. One was the Vietnam War that drew my attention to international relations, particularly U.S. East Asia relations, and I wanted to know why the United States was in Southeast Asia and why the United States generally was so involved in Asia. The other reason was because of my father. My father was an artist and was involved in promoting U.S.-China friendship in the 1940s. As a cultural figure, he actually even came to the United States. He came here in 1940, just before Pearl Harbor, and to help promote goodwill between the two countries. So I was always interested in his career and his vision as an artist and intellectual. He was a professor of art in China, but also his commitment to seeking to somehow use his artwork to promote goodwill between the two countries who became allies. So that's also the connection to my interest in art. I was always interested in his work and how he saw the world as an artist. Um, but at the time when I was in graduate school, now the second time around, and then now in the 1980s, now there was something called Asian American Studies, very embryonic. There were teachers who were teaching Asian American studies. Actually, I taught Asian American studies. The first class was I took at Stanford. I helped teach in 1971 or 72. So I was interested in Asian American history independently of any. I've never taken any class in Asian American history, Asian American studies, and I had to sort of pioneer it all along. But by the time of dissertation writing, I faced the issue of what to write about and making the choice. The first idea I had was actually to write a dissertation about my aunt Alice Fong Yu. She was still living. I did oral histories with her. She had a voluminous archive. So I thought about doing a biography of her. And I actually floated the idea to who are now my professors above me in the history department at Stanford, and they were not really too keen on it. I mean, they were not keen on the idea of Asian American history at all. I mean, one of them said, not to my face, but to others I heard about later on, and said, Asian Americans don't have any history. And how can that be? And what he meant was Asian Americans don't have a history because there are no archives, there's not the paper documentation that traditional historians like. But that's sort of a blunt statement about what they saw about Asian American history. They certainly didn't value it very much or even think it was worthwhile for me to do. And that's how I kind of pivoted to thinking about international relations and something that had preoccupied me, which was some of the history of U.S.-China relations, particularly during the Cold War. And that's what I wound up doing in that first book, Friends and Enemies, which explores the U.S.-China relations from roughly 1948, before the Chinese Revolution, to 1972 to when Nixon goes to China. So what happens in those years that sort of a prelude to Nixon's trip to China. And in particular, I was interested in the relationship of China, of U.S. policy, and how the United States thought about, perceived the relationship between the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists. So there was a high level sort of diplomatic history, far removed from Aunt Alice.
I was thinking that about the ways in which Asian Americans are racialized as foreigners, and so because of that form of racialization, that are the perceptions of Asian Americans, the ways they're treated, are often shaped by U.S.-Asia relations. They're often shaped by international tensions, whether it has to do with economics or politics um, or military conflict. Um, So it just seems like even though international diplomatic history might seem removed from Asian American, that it seems like there's actually a very much an integration of those perspectives.
Well, certainly, I think we all, maybe more so than ever, because of the China initiative and the COVID anti-Asian violence, that to be reminded of how important international events, the significance international events, the implications international events have on the domestic population, whether it's for Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, that race and ethnicity and prejudices and assumptions about different peoples are not stopped by formal boundaries. And so in the book, I do explore this relationship between international relations and race and racial thinking and Asian Americans at home. So the first two chapters of the book, the first one is actually examines John F. Kennedy's deep fear about the Chinese Communist China PRC getting the nuclear capacity and getting the atomic bomb. And in studying that, I found, went deep into different records about JFK and discovered that he was really, really quite prejudiced against Chinese, and not just the communists, but about China. He said essentially that Chinese or Asians had a lower regard to human life. And we heard all this during the Vietnam War, of course. But Kennedy had that same view, and that was why he was so fearful of Chinese communists getting the nuclear weapon, because if they did, Southeast Asia, much of Asia would just fall to the communists, and that they had no fear of a nuclear war and this type of thing. But it was quite clear was that his racial thinking didn't stop at the boundaries. I mean, it was just sort of reflected the general American public's view of Asians, demeaning views of Asians during the 50s and 1960s. And the second chapter is on how Dwight Eisenhower thought about PRC and also shared similar racial notions about Kennedy. So that sets up other chapters in the book where I talk about exactly what you've talked about, international relations and its implications for Asian Americans, including us today, whether we're international students or whether scientists or others that have come under suspicion because of the tensions between the United States and China.
I know that the Cold War was very formative for you, both personally and intellectually and politically. We think about right, the fall of China. We think about the Korean War, the Vietnam War. But I also wonder if the Cold War is over, especially in Asia, given the divides between the North and South Korea, between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. I'm just curious about your thoughts because you continue to teach right, international politics, but also in relation to Asian American history. Do you think the Cold War is over in Asia?
The course I'm teaching this quarter here at Stanford is what I call 350 years of America-China relations. So it's a social history, not diplomatic history, not a political history so much as talking about the long interactions between the peoples of the two countries, good and bad. Those that have been sympathetic and sentimental, one side towards the other, are deeply racist and hateful, which we also see. And that is linked to geopolitics, as you said, about the Cold War. And the Cold War was a time of great hostility, tension between uh, Washington and Moscow and Beijing. But one of the points I make in the book and other things I've written is that although we think about the Cold War as principally a conflict between Moscow and Washington, Washington had really deep sentiments about the danger of Beijing and communism in Asia, and that explains all the wars that had took place, the American inventions in Asia, and the continuing, I would say, fear of now Beijing, particularly, always the fear of Beijing and China being such a big country, communist country, that now so many observers and political figures say is the biggest threat to the United States. So that's very worrisome to me because we don't have to look very far, World War II and other times where we see international events having direct impact upon our populations here at home with Japanese Americans, Muslim Americans, and this. And there's a really worrisome backlash against Asian Americans that we saw during COVID, but that's connected to also geopolitical. It's not just the fear of COVID, the Asians. When I was walking just after COVID crisis broke, I was walking around my neighborhood here on the Stanford campus, and I walked by another couple. Everyone around here are all Stanford connected, and this woman looked right at me and sort of hostily said, "Did you just come from China?" I said, "What? You just come from China?" And so sort of like very aggressive and hostile is that I was now kind of a walking germ. And I had my Stanford hat on and t-shirt and like this. So this fear of contamination, of racial danger is very, very deep.
I want to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned that your original dissertation topic was about your aunt, and you wrote a biography on Yamada Ishihashi, and there's a number of essays in your current book that focus on particular individuals and sometimes the naming confusion or misidentification. Um, Having a biographical approach to history, which I also appreciate, is very different from looking at formal politics. And so I'm just interested in your shift into that realm of historical analysis and writing. And what do you find maybe challenging? What do you find rewarding about the focus on the individual?
I'm interesting you raised that, Judy. I mean, and for those who don't know, Judy's dissertation and her first book was a biography on a first Chinese American Western trained physician who, in fact, I don't think you know, Judy, was friends with my Aunt Alice. They're the same generation. I don't know if did we ever talk about this? I think we did.
I
So,
loved, oh, whenever I asked Gordon for advice about research projects, he would just pull out something from his family history and say, just don't study this.
yeah. So, well, maybe you and I will talk more about it. I can tell you some of the stories that at least circulated within the family. So, the family did know. Um, what was her name? Your subject?
It was Margaret Jessie Chung.
Margaret Chung. Yeah, yeah. So, I've always appreciated biography. And I think many of us do, speaking for us, because biography is such an accessible and fundamental way of trying to understand the past. Some of the most popular books have been about biographies all the time. Robert Oppenheimer or Einstein or writers, uh, Philip Roth, where there's a new biography on him. There's new biographies all the time. You look at any book section, there's lots of biographies. And that's because we can relate to the to the subjects, but also the biography, a life trajectory, provides an immediate structure for a book. But I've always said that biography is fundamental history. History is about people, and it's about contexts of events and large groups of people, small groups of people, and that's true for individuals. How we make sense of somebody's life. There are the specific decisions individuals make, but they all live within contexts, and they all have meaning. Their lives have meaning because of the connections where they lived and the connections they made. And that's what I think is important, as you do in your biographical work, as I do, is to connect the individual stories with the wider community, social, and even national, international pictures.
I was wondering if you can say more about your work on the transnational railroad workers, because um, there were so many people whose lives were involved in building these infrastructures for transportation, and so little documentation about their perspectives, their lives. And it was such an incredible feat of research collaboration. So if you could say a little bit more about what that process, some of the challenges, but maybe some of the joys of that process as well.
I'd long been interested in the railroad workers ever since I was a youngster. Some of those pictures I showed you earlier. I heard about Chinese American history and the railroad workers and farmers and this, but there was so little information. about Chinese American history in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then began to change when we all came on board. Um, so even though I was interested in the railroad workers, there was not much I could to learn about them from the published record. I remember coming to Stanford the first time I came to Stanford out of undergraduate, and I was poking around, looking at the libraries. Wonderful. I always loved libraries, I love archives. And I certainly I knew Leland Stanford's connection to the railroad, and so I went to Green Library and I asked around what kind of archives are there on Leland Stanford? Does he anything about the railroad? And all I said, no, there's not, because all this stuff was destroyed. Jane Stanford destroyed his paper, lots of his papers. But I looked at the lobby of Green Library at that time, and there was a big picture board of Leland Stanford right there in the entryway to the full library, original wing. And there was a big picture of him dressed in dark woolens, top hat, and he was leaning on a pickaxe. And underneath there was the caption, Leland Stanford, builder of the Transcontinental Railroad. I thought, oh my goodness, this is something that has to be taken addressed. But it wasn't until around 2012, when I did have some time and a break in some of my other research, that I and other colleagues at Stanford put together this big project of trying to research the history of Chinese railroad workers, something that's a project of that side never been put together before for the railroad or workers or for anything else, actually. It was the largest research project on an Asian American topic uh, to date. And we knew had to have a lot of resources because as much as I poked around the previous years and other people, other historians, great historians, him, Mark Lai, and others, it was very, very little information that we found about the railroad workers. Nothing from the railroad workers themselves, and that was the biggest challenge of how do you write about some a people or experience, and you don't have anything from the people who are involved from themselves. So there are no diaries, no letters, no even oral histories. Um, so we said we really had to try to dig deep. Sent people out all around California to local libraries, to families to see if anybody could find any hidden archives. Sent to people in Asia, Hong Kong, Macau, uh, China. We worked with scholars in China, worked with scholars in Canada, and no one found any original archival material. So that's why Ghost of Gold Mountain is the way it is that it's not based upon a rich documentary base, but it adopts a methodology that draws from context, from materials, other materials that exist at the time, and tries to present a compelling and plausible history of what the Chinese railroad workers endured based upon other evidence, including archaeological the material, what's called the material culture of the things they left behind in the labor camps were all along the railroad. Shards of porcelain, of gaming pieces, pieces of clothes, even the orientation of these labor camps gave us some indication of their thinking. So there was a lot of little bits here and there we put together as best we could to put together the story. Now, I will share with you something that's just happened to me just the past 2 days. And I've not shared this with anybody, so you're all all privy to breaking news. This fellow from New Jersey, I never met him, wrote me out of the blue and said, I have something I'd like to talk with you about Honghua. And for those who've read the book, Ghost of Gold Mountain, this character that I call Honghua, a man who actually lived and who was a labor contractor and a worker on the Transcontinental Railroad, I build the narrative around him and his life. But he's just sort of shadowy. We just have little bits and pieces, newspaper articles that mention him, payroll records that mention him, but nothing really very substantial. No photos of him. And later on, an obituary. He died in the early 20th century, long life in California. But anyway, this fellow, who was a gun collector, says he's got a pistol that is inscribed, it's donated, it's given to the local constable in Auburn, California in 1860 is inscribed on that on one side of the handle, and on the other side it said given by Hong Hua. Oh, this Chinese labor contractor apparently gave a gun to his buddy, a business partner, and constable, not quite a sheriff. Constable was not quite in law enforcement, but now I was blown away by now seeing his name. It's authentic, right on this handle of this pistol, which is the ivory handle, and it's engraved uh, clearly, as you can see, given by Honghua. So it's
That's
an actual touch with history.
That's wonderful. I remember kind of going through archives and all of a sudden finding that needle in the haystack and realizing that my historical subject is not just a figment of my imagination, but they actually left real traces of their lives.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Um, I wanted to shift a little bit more to kind of the last section of your book, but it's part of your other sections of the book as well, and your focus on art and writing and culture. I mean, you have a piece that's actually in the middle of your anthology that looks at comic books. So I'm curious, again, you're shifting away from formal politics to social history and now to cultural history. Um, yeah, could you talk a little bit more? I know it comes from your family background, your father being an artist. But what about you as an intellectual, as an academic, as a researcher, shifting your focus towards cultural history and your understanding of that field and how you want to conceive it?
I've been interested in historical methodology, which refers to the way academic or scholars such as us write about history, understand history, access history. Writing history is not a simple task. It's not straightforward. You just find documents and you write what's in the documents. Certainly, there's interpretation, there's context. Even how we choose a subject has to be a careful choice. So I've been interested in various ways that history related to Asian Americans has been accessed. Though the first part of the book relies heavily, that's the articles, for example, of JFK and Eisenhower, are almost exclusively based upon government documentation in the archives, the immense archives of the United States have, the Kennedy Library, the Eisenhower Library, and the National Archives. Millions, tens of millions of documents generated from within the government. Now we have a worry because now administrations are cutting back on the access and even they're destroying lots of archives now. So this is a great worry of historians about how we're going to be able to write out history when the written record is destroyed. But there are other ways of thinking about history. We have visuals, photographs, music. We have personal records such as diaries, and then we also have the art history of the writing of poetry, uh, painting of others. And so I use them too to think about those forms of expression as forms of documentation that give us some indication about people's lives. And I suppose I got into this a bit going back to Ichihashi, the Japanese American professor who was at Stanford, I wrote about. So I really got into his life and to think about his writing as intellectual history. Um, so I think I've had a different approach to history. I know colleagues, they'll have one subject, maybe one founding father, and they'll spend their whole life just writing about one founding father, or writing, about one person. I've never had that approach. I've been satisfied, but I've been sort of restless to think about a variety of subjects, time periods, and approaches to history.
I really appreciate your facility and interest in moving between different approaches and the variety of topics that you've researched and shared with us, and that it's so wonderful to have all at least a sample of your work in the book on war, race, and culture. I know we wanted to save some time for people in the audience for them to ask questions. Katie, do you want me to pose a question, or do you want to do so?
Sure. Yeah. So we have two questions from the audience already. And for others who would like to ask a question, feel free to post your question in the chat or in the Q&A feature. But I'll go ahead and read off the first question. So, Gordon, what were the factors that led you from being an activist to going into academia?
Ah, okay, good question. Well, I had been a good student, also an activist at Princeton. I was very ambivalent about what to do with myself after undergraduate because I was very motivated to continue to be a social activist, radical activist. There's still a lot going on. But I was also really liked academic life. So I was torn and ambivalent. And I did go into graduate school at Stanford after undergraduate, but I didn't last very long because, as I said, I found it too restrictive for me. And I left and moved to San Francisco and became active with others in the emerging Asian American radical movement. Um, but why did I return to academia? Uh, I'll put it sort of bluntly and maybe somewhat sarcastic. Well, the revolution didn't happen. By 90, the revolution didn't happen, but Reagan happened. And the country now, instead of seeing the possibility of radical transformation, which seemed to be real in the late 60s and through the 70s, with the social forces that were uprising throughout the country in that time, and then they subsided. And then the return to some normalcy, and then the triumph of a conservative view with Reagan. And I said, well, look, I can't sustain being a radical, getting older, and maybe now's the time to go back to graduate school. And that's what I did.
Sensible. Um, we have another question. How has Asian American studies been impacted by anti-DEI initiatives by Trump 2.0?
Well, that's a good question, contemporary right now. We're all very concerned about this. Right now, there's not a direct effect upon the offerings Stanford has in Asian American studies. We have a really good, robust Asian American studies program. We've just founded the Asian American Research Center at Stanford. I'm the inaugural director, and I think many of you have contributed to it or know about it, and we welcome you to be more in contact with us. This research center seeks to support research on Asian American studies at Stanford. So we have 50 faculty members who are signed up or connected to us, and most of the different schools, social science, humanities, law. So we have a really robust program in Asian American studies, both teaching and in research. Now, it has Trump and so forth has affected us because some of the colleagues have already suffered. Uh, they had assumed they would have research grants for the summer, this past summer, or even coming up. They got the research grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities or others, and they were canceled by the Trump administration. So that set back their research efforts. And I've been talking to others around the country, and this is not just for Asian American studies, but for many different fields. But this has set back Asian American studies. Uh, do we fear that there might be an attack upon the very possibility of offering Asian American studies? We haven't seen that quite yet, but I think all around the country we are worried that can come to be. I think I mentioned that just today or yesterday with this Stanford announced they ending this special graduate program called Diversity and I can't remember the full name of the acronym, but it was an 8-year-old program that supported DEI in graduate admissions, and they just ended that.
We have another question from George Pedgelow, I think is how you say it. And we'll see if this is something that feels relevant to you, Gordon. The question is, does Taoism still play a role in Chinese communities?
Well, Taoism is the name of a school of thought, not quite a religion. It's a sort of philosophy, a way of life. Uh, it has a long history within China. Um, and it does have influence in the United States, as other Asian formal religions do, including, if you want to say Confucianism, or there could be more organized Confucianism, or Buddhism in particular. And Taoism, I find is appealing to a lot of people in the United States and Asian American communities because of its view of the relationship of humans to the natural order, of the idea of trying to find grace and humility and peace in the world, and as a way of living that's more, I think, quite giving. And so I think it's still around. Actually, one of my buddies in college went on, not Asian American, but he got very much taken with Taoism. And he went on to get a PhD in Chinese philosophy. And he just recently, he says he translated the most recent edition of the Tao Te Ching, which is the foundation text for Taoism.
Great. Our next question is from Adrian Arima, and he asks, do any Chinese universities teach Asian American studies?
Hi, Adrian. I hope you're doing well. Adrian's a great supporter of Asian American Studies. Sam, he and Monica, his wife. Thank you very much. They don't quite teach Asian American Studies, but some of them are interested in Asian American Studies. In fact, my cousin, we go back to that picture, showing that Christmas picture, a very interesting Christmas picture with that Santa Claus in the front. I don't know who that was. One of the cousins who dressed up as Santa. Well, one of the other cousins of that group there, we have four from us who became PhDs. And one of the other PhDs is now just retired from Brown University. My cousin Bob Robert Lee. And he was in China recently to give talks. He's a specialist in Asian American studies and American studies, and he was invited over to give a series of talks about Asian American studies. So some time ago there was not, and some time ago there was interest in what we call overseas Chinese, a big rubric, big kind of a general category of Chinese people of Chinese ancestry who lived outside of China. But now there's a better understanding of about, say, Chinese Americans. We're Americans of Chinese ancestry who are not overseas Chinese, but also have a distinct history other than other Americans.
Could I just chime in for a couple things? I went to a Chinese diaspora conference in Guangdong, which is where the province where the kind of original Chinese tended to come from to the United States. And it was just fascinating because there are UNESCO sites that have been named that commemorate the money that was donated by overseas Chinese back to the home village. And there's physical structures, there's buildings that returning merchants then built. And they were multiple levels to try to protect the family from bandits who are, in the kind of in the region. And there were also different levels for each of the wives that these merchants had. So it was just so fascinating to see it in the built environment, the overseas connections from the railroad workers and the merchants who came to Gold Mountain to the United States. And then also I'll just mention that I've been in the process of trying to create a program that uses photography to facilitate conversations across borders. So we're going to be working with Mark Liang. For those who might know, Karen Liang is a professor in Asian American Studies. Mark Liang is her brother, and he's a professional photographer. He arrived in China the day after Tiananmen and spent a couple decades trying to capture all the changes that were occurring in China. Now is back in Alameda, So he's going to be working with students in China and the United States to create portfolios about their sense of identities and their sense of values and communities. And then we're going to do an international exchange. And part of that will include instruction about Chinese American, Asian American history. So I'm looking forward to that process.
So Jen H asks, how do you see AI being used in research going forward, and any specific effects for Asian American studies?
Um, AI is a big challenge to us academics. It's a challenge and a worry because AI can be misused by undergraduate students to generate papers that they don't write themselves. I worry about that with my classes. I have explicit guidelines about using AI in my classes and how not to use AI. Um, but there is great promise as well. As some of you may know, particularly in the medical diagnosis area, there's great possibilities of using AI. And that includes a lot of Asian Americans who are at the medical school here. I know are using that to investigate uh, uh, illnesses and how to diagnose using powerful tools of AI. Um, but I wouldn't, maybe, Judy might have an idea, but I would say this is not necessarily AI, but I think one one work that needs to be done, and is being done by scholars of Asian American studies, is much more quantitative history, as using demographics, using economic history, using voter rolls, to really develop a quantitative sense of Asian American history, not just qualitative paintings or diaries or something like this, but the quantitative work. And that's going to be challenging. Like it all comes up all the time. For example, railroad workers, they'll ask, what difference economically did completion of the Transcontinental Railroad mean for California? And what was the economic contribution of the Chinese railroad workers? What was their added value to the railroad? That's a tough question, which I can't even begin to think about. But maybe now with the computer tools that we have, we can start to get closer to those answers.
I'll just share one project that a student of mine did. It wasn't Asian American Studies. He's Latinx and interested in the experiences of undocumented migrants. He did interviews with people on the last day that they were in their home country. And he used the interview to generate images, used AI to generate images of what that scene might have looked like. And he's a filmmaker. I was a little bit nervous. I was like, is this historically accurate? But he then went back to the people we interviewed and then showed them the images and then had more conversations so that the image was a way to elicit more memories, more details. So I just thought it was really fascinating way of using AI to really capture human experiences and to help spark kind of memories of the past. So I'm intrigued by what might be possible.
And we have one final question from Bianca Ling, who asks, where do you see the Asian American radical movement going in the future? Where are there areas and shared goals for coalition building?
Well, thanks, Bianca. Great to thank you for being in the room. Good question. I think the Asian American radical movement is much reduced than it was some years ago, as all radical movements in the United States. So I can say that on the one hand, that in terms of what we used to see as radicalism is much less evidence now. But that doesn't mean that there's less radical sentiment. In fact, among the students I have, Asian American students as sentiment, there's quite a bit of what might call radical sentiment. There's a lot of anti-Trump sentiment, anti-Asian American violence sentiment, support for workers, for housing, anti-ICE effort, support for international movements, including in Palestine and Gaza. It goes on and on. And I hear from the students all the time is they said, these are things we want to do, but how do we sustain this? What do we do? And they want to know what lessons do you might have from the past? And I said, really, we didn't have any guidance. We didn't have any blueprints at the time. You just have to really think about what you want to do now. It's a very different circumstance to build radical movements today. and you have to figure it on your own. Now, as tough as that may sound, there's also, I find, fascinating possibilities for Asian American politics. I'll put it this way, not just radical movement, but politics. If you look at the mayor's races that have been won by Asian Americans in Oakland and Boston, even now perhaps in New York City, I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. We had Kamala Harris, who openly identifies as with her South Asian heritage. So we have Asian Americans coming forward in political and civic life as never before. And many of them are very progressive. So I think just to end here, I think the prospects in the future are really daunting because of what is coming out of Washington, D.C. But at the same time, I'm quite encouraged by what I see coming from the communities.
Well, I'd like to say thank you, Gordon and Judy, so much for this evening of thought-provoking discussion. I think it was such a great way to give us all an overview, Gordon, of your career and work, but also really to think about how far we've come with Asian American studies and, all the work that still has to be done, especially in this difficult climate. So really appreciate you both for tonight's event, and thank you all for tuning in. So until next time,
Thank you, Katie.
good.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing. I really enjoyed participating in this conversation, especially because it's in honor of my advisor, Gordon Chang.
Absolutely. Hope to have you guys back soon. All right. Good night.
Thank you
Bye.
all.